Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Xiaobei Chen, Professor of Sociology at Carleton University and the President of the Canadian Sociological Association. On behalf of the association, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar titled Racialized Policing in Canada and the Drive to Defund Police. I would like to open our event with land acknowledgement. We want to acknowledge the Indigenous nations on whose lands we are meeting today, wherever that may be, to thank them for the opportunity to present our thoughts on their territories. We would also like to pay our respects to elders of these lands, both past and present. To acknowledge these lands is to recognize the history and the legacy of settler colonialism. It is to recognize this land's significance to Indigenous peoples. And it is to remind us of our role and responsibility as settlers towards repudiating colonialism. Tonight's session is part of the CSA series on Canadian policing, colonialism, and racism. As the debate about policing is becoming a major contentious issue for sociology departments across the country and for Canadian society, it is important that we create public space to discuss these things among ourselves, sociologists, and with the wider community. Our event tonight is co-sponsored by the CSA and the Decriminalization and Punishment Education Project. I would like to especially thank Professor Doyle for organizing this event. Erin is my colleague and a professor of sociology at Carleton, and a co-founder of the Decriminalization and the Punishment Education Project. You can't see him on the screen, but he did a lot of work to make today's event possible. Thank you so much, Erin. I also would like to thank Sherry Fox, our executive director, for her work behind the scene, which is indispensable for this event and many others. I want to add a note about the technical details. For tonight's event, you have two options to interact with the panelists. You can use chat and to leave your comments and the questions. Using chat, only the panelists can view your comments or questions. Alternatively, you can also use Q&A. There you can write your questions. You can also click to like any questions you would like us to prioritize. We are very grateful to have Elle Jones as the moderator for tonight's event. Elle Jones is a spoken word poet, an educator, journalist, and a community activist living in African Nova Scotia. She was the 5th Poet Laureate of Halifax. In 2016, Elle was a recipient of the Bernie Rocky Jones Human Rights Award for his community work and work in prison justice. She was recently appointed by Halifax Board of Police Commissioners to propose a committee to define defunding police. Elle is a co-founder of the Black Power Hour, a live radio show with incarcerated people on CKDU that creates space for people inside to share the creative work and discuss contemporary social and political issues. And along with this work, she supports women in Nova Institution in writing and sharing their voices. Elle served as the 15th Nancy's Chair of Women's Studies at Mount St. Vincent University for the 2017 to 2019 term. Elle, we are very honored to have you moderating this event tonight. Now I'll turn it over to you to let you introduce our distinguished speakers.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the Canadian Sociological Association for organizing this, and to Doyle and CPEP for their ongoing support, not only events like this, but of course of people directly dealing with state violence and incarceration. When Aaron asked me to help organize this event and suggested that two of the names that he was hoping would participate were Desmond Cole and Robyn Maynard, I immediately agreed, not so much to have a sociological conversation, but just to have one more chance to be in a space and in conversation with two comrades and very dear friends who we don't only talk in these kind of public spaces, but of course are engaged in the daily struggle of fighting anti-Black racism in Canada and state violence. So I'm sure both of you know both of these speakers. I'm not going to read their formal bios. Desmond Cole, of course, is the author of the book that was the #1 bestseller in Canada throughout the summer, The Skin We're In. And also, of course, there's a documentary of the same name. He's a winner of the Ken Philkow Prize for particularly his commitment to advocacy, including leaving his job at the Toronto Star when asked to choose between activism and journalism. And those are the public things that people know about Desmond. But Desmond is also really a co-conspirator with me, a co-organizer, the person in the team, you know, I turn to when I need, whether it's an intellectual ear to bounce ideas off of, an edit. We work together in collaboration to fight deportations and to fight imprisonment and to do this work in community all the time. So without Desmond, my ideas would not be as shaped as they are, my discourse would not be as sharp as it is, and my mental health would not be as resilient as it is without Desmond there to help support me in this work. So welcome, Desmond. I'm really glad to be sharing this space with you here. And don't say anything because I'm just going to introduce Robyn and then we can all talk. And then equally so, I'm going to introduce Robyn Maynard, of course, the author of Policing Black Lives, which I'm sure we are all teaching in our courses. And we are so grateful for Robyn for providing us with this text. And I will tell you, written in the conditions that Black women live in while mothering, while dealing with the deprivations that Black women live in. So it's amazing that she has brought us this book out of those conditions that continues to speak to Blackness, state violence, and particularly to provide us a much broader lens of policing than is always available to us. Robyn is also a co-conspirator and comrade in the struggle. Her work on deportation, working with incarcerated people. She was working through the summer with people hunger striking while in detention, fighting, of course, state deportation. She's constantly working with women who are facing the intersections of race and gender and criminalization, particularly with queer and trans people as well. Another person who can always offer you an ear, offer you love as we go through this academic journey as Black women together, somebody who can offer counsel and someone I just really dearly rely on as well. So I'm so happy to be sharing space with both of these two brilliant people tonight, and now they can come on camera. And can we lose the slides? Yes, perfect. All right, so thank you, both of you, for participating. I will say as well that I am joining from Jabuktuk, Halifax in Mi'kma'ki, the territory of the Mi'kmaq people that is unceded and unsurrendered, and governed by the Peace and Friendship Treaties of 1752, signed at a time when, of course, Black people were enslaved by that same crown. So we also want to think about the intersections of anti-Blackness and settler colonialism together. Thank you, both of you, for doing this talk. I don't know if you want to say any introductory comments before we jump into a broader conversation. Desmond, go ahead.
I just want to say thank you for that intro, Elle, and how happy I am to be doing this with you and with Robyn, because I love you guys, because we are friends, because we are siblings in the struggle, and because we have a lot to talk about. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you to the Canadian Sociological Association. Really looking forward to this.
And Robyn? Oh, you're on mute, my dear.
Voila. I was just saying, yeah, I'm really happy to be here with all of you. Elle, I'm really glad, to have you moderating this conversation. I hope we can pull you out and have you participate exactly as much, because I think you have, as much, if not more, to say about any of these topics as myself and Desmond. I also want to thank the organizers, the Canadian Sociological Association, and anybody that may be tuning in this evening. And thanks, Desmond too. I'm really glad that you're here. So I'm looking forward to sharing this space with all of you for the next hour or so.
Thank you. Just a quick order of business. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes and we'll use the rest of the time for questions. I see people already putting questions in the box, so keep doing that. You know, I don't wear glasses that I need to, so I'm going to be leaning in to read these questions. So if I'm getting close to the camera, don't be creeped out. I'm just going to do that moderation work of gathering the questions at the end. So make sure you do provide those questions for us. The first thing, and Robyn, this will be my jump in for the evening. You can see that I'm wearing a Who is Randy Riley t-shirt. So I wanted to frame this, and this is going to lead into my first question to you. Those who aren't aware of Randy Riley, this week in the Supreme Court of Canada, an appeal was heard that was successful that sends Randy back for new trial and vacates his conviction on second-degree murder. I believe strongly and have always believed that this is a wrongful conviction of an African Nova Scotian man. As this conviction has progressed, information has come forward about, for example, witnesses being paid, the Crown concealing those witnesses, concealing the payment, the cop lying on the stand and the Crown knowing about it. So the usual shenanigans that take place, and I'm not going to take up the whole time discussing this case. If people have questions, you can do it in the Q&A. But I say that because, first of all, I always want to honor Randy and his particular contributions to my work and to the work of prison abolition everywhere. Randy was one of the leaders of the prison strike in 2018 in Burnside and continued while incarcerated to organize both incarcerated people and workers, you know, that were coming in, for example, from the town near the prison and having conversations with them about prison labor and the conditions of the prison and race, and doing this real on the ground organic work, and particularly working with the inmate committee as well. And so I say that to say that was part of my week. And I wanted to begin this conversation to move us from our kind of academic theoretical lens and say, so what, in even the last couple of weeks, what have you been contending with in this work we do on the ground as we shape our understandings of what it means to fight and work against state violence? Let's just get the rundown, I guess. And I think that's important because I think it frames how constant and how unrelenting this work is, like how much and how many times and how often we are dealing through these issues. So Robyn, I'm going to start with you. Just give us that kind of breakdown of the things you've been involved in. And you're still on mute.
You might have to remind me of that every time. I mean, something that I can share is one thing that I've been putting a lot of work into over the last, it started as a small-ish project, but it's become a little bit more consuming, but I'm happy for that, is really putting together a toolkit about defunding in Canada, about what it is, what it isn't, what it looks like, and really trying to pull together a lot of the work that's been happening, you know, just really beautiful work around the country, in Winnipeg, in Fredericton, in Vancouver, to remove police from schools, to decouple police from immigration controls, just the broad array of things that, you know, the topic of this webinar, defunding police, the broad array of things that defunding police actually is, right? Which is actually this transformative, radical, care-based labor. So trying to really come together in one place so that we can really have kind of a document that I think will be helpful as a movement document that we can look to better understand what's happening, particularly as we have, you know, certain parts of the press and certain sort of, I guess, political investments that are really geared towards spreading misinformation about what defunding the police means, either de-radicalizing it, divorcing it from abolition, where we know that it is really on a path towards, or that work of just, you know, delegitimizing the work. So what I wanted to do was really just to, like, pay tribute to all the incredible sort of kaleidoscopic visions for freedom that have emerged over the last few months and put together something that was comprehensive, that could really help us all, I think, hopefully, that could really help us all continue to move forward as this struggle is, of course, dies down in the very visible realm, but at the same time, we know that once things take off, they're just going on behind the background until the next sort of media spotlight. So that is a little bit of what I've been doing at this exact time. Yeah.
Thank you. Desmond, I don't know if you want to fill in as well.
I'm really looking forward to that resource, Robyn, because it's something that I feel like we're always kind of informally doing in one way or another. We're getting news from different parts of the country about different organizing and different campaigns that are happening, but it's really actually hard to know the kind of sum total of it. So that's going to be a really amazing tool. I mean, just one thing that I have been thinking about and trying to share some light on in the last week or two is the police custody death of a 30-year-old Black and trans woman named Coco, who had a confrontation with the police a couple of Mondays ago, which from all of what we've heard reported so far was actually about a break-in that police found no evidence of. So the police get called to a high-rise apartment in North Toronto. They are told that there's a break-in occurring in this apartment, and they attend. And by their own admission, they don't find any evidence of any break-in. But there is a 30-year-old woman who we believe is in some kind of crisis, barricaded inside of her apartment building unit. The police decide that they are going to apprehend this 30-year-old woman under the Mental Health Act. They take her to a hospital, and she's pronounced dead a short time later. The Special Investigations Unit issued a release for this. Of course, the oversight, the so-called police oversight in this province, who are called every time that somebody is believed to have been assaulted, killed, or sexually assaulted by a police officer. The SIU was called. The SIU issued a press release about this custody death of Coco, but they did not name her, and in fact, they misgendered her. So they referred to this as happening to a man. And it was another week before people in community who knew Coco began speaking out and saying, this is who was taken and died in police custody. This is her name. We loved her, we cared about her, and we demand to know what's been happening. And without activism, that story wouldn't have even made the major mainstream news. And now that the activism is occurring, I note that there's this still persistent resistance to talking about this issue in Toronto. We were very eager to talk about George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. When it's going on in another country and it's evidence of anti-Blackness and state violence and white supremacy in America, well, that's something that we can all get behind apparently in this country. But when we want to talk about a Black trans woman dying in police custody for reasons unknown, the level of aggressiveness on the part of our media and on the part of politicians who this summer were saying that they understood the calls for police defunding that we're going to get into, we don't see the same energy, basically. And that's one thing that I've been thinking about a lot, because people are trying very hard to organize on behalf of Coco and to find out what happened. And I am very much, interested in us holding the police to account, knowing that if we as activists and community folks don't do that, then what this becomes is another file. And the SIU takes weeks, months, and years sometimes even to investigate these issues. And in the meantime, the media doesn't feel, and the politicos, the powers that be, certainly don't feel like they have any role or right to intervene in the meantime. And this is how our death becomes erased by this state. And we don't want that to happen to Coco. And we wish that this hadn't happened in the first place. So that's something that I've been thinking about a lot.
Thank you, Desmond. And you raised a few issues there I want to put a pin in and come back to, including oversight agencies and what I've called the violence of the paperwork, this world of reports and endless inquiries, etc. But Robyn, you were talking about the particular impetus to de-radicalize this conversation about defunding. And I thought that's a good place to start. Desmond, I know you have a lot of thoughts on this, in particularly the ways that a lot of city councils and other bodies have picked up the notion of defunding in very limited ways. So I thought we could start in that conversation there, and particularly the attempts, as Robyn identified, to decouple defunding from abolition, and to often place defunding into a particular kind of capitalist framework, which is much easier for people to comprehend. Okay, it's about moving money from one column to another column, rather than about a wholesale overthrowing a particular system. So either one of you, and we can just get into this conversation, you don't have to sort of wait for me to ask a question, but I think that's a really good place to start. Desmond, I know you had quite a few thoughts on that earlier, and I know Robyn, you do as well. So let's talk about this, the limitations of the defunding framework, what's happening in this moment, around the ways people are taking defunding in the wrong directions, and perhaps also what kind of organizing you think can and should be taking place.
Sure. So I really appreciate that question. And I think I also appreciate the way that it's being framed as the way that defunding is being taken up in a way that I think it is working to de-radicalize it, because I think that there are sometimes unfair critiques being leveled about the idea of defunding being only about budget reallocation, when I think that we just need to pay really due respect and honor to some of the really brilliant architects behind this particular demand and the way that it's been articulated. Particularly, I'm thinking about Black feminists like Miriam Kaba, like Andrea Ritchie, like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who've done so much to really put into the world this sort of understanding of defunding police as being, in some ways a shorthand and a step toward a broader project, which is about the abolition of police, the abolition of carceral controls more broadly. So I think it's really important to remember that, what has suddenly sort of in this way that was unimaginable months ago become something that we can now talk about on national news, the kind of thing that is covered in op-eds, is actually really something that comes from quite radical roots. So I never want to erase the really important lineage of political labor that has actually gone into making this a broader framework. I wrote this about it in an article that's coming out pretty soon, that the defund police movement is nothing less than an attack on one of the most enduring forms of racial violence and anti-Black carceral controls since slavery, a rethinking of the sexual and gendered and transphobic violences at the heart of the colonial project. I think that we can think about it as a transformative project, as this beautiful care-based way of recreating and giving a new meaning to the word of safety in our society, that moves away the idea that police and prisons more broadly are the thing that keeps us safe, that expose the idea that, in fact, particularly for Black people, but for anybody in a mental health crisis, for anybody living in poverty, for anybody who doesn't neatly fit into the accepted gender binary, that police are themselves a kind of harm in our society, or in fact, the opposite of safety. So what I see the defunding movement being is actually about the creation of a real felt kind of safety and security in our society. So I think that, as you're pointing out, Elle, of course, there's this notion, part of it really is absolutely about exactly what it stands for, which is taking away this massive, massive, massive allocation of public dollars, of tax dollars that at this time go towards repression of Black people in city streets vis-a-vis carding, police stops, and other realities, whether that's the policing of the war on drugs and all the unnecessary and tragic deaths that result because of the overdose crisis, because of people not being able to call the police, because of the criminalization of drugs, right? That are about minimum. So it's about really, in a sense, actually taking money away from the ability of the police to encounter and therefore, in many ways, harm our community members, right? So this idea, part of that is about decoupling the police from as many places as we can, right? So in one way we saw before defunding became a kind of household term, which I just love that I can say a sentence like before defunding became a household term. But I think that we need to look back, even within our trajectory of decoupling police from schools is something that we saw happening before this movement took off in this very visible way, with the work of Black Lives Matter Toronto, of Latin, of Education Not Incarceration. And Desmond, you covered this in your book, right? The work of taking the police, understanding the police as a sort of harm to Black children, to children more broadly, and taking them away from schools, saying that there's no place where agents of harm and violence should be encountering our children, right? And there's a broader push as well that I think is so vital to decouple police from ambulances, and particularly from overdose responses, right? Understanding the very particular risks that drug users face when being faced with either arrest or death. We know that this is something, and drug users and harm reduction groups have been so clear in advocating that this is such a clear and egregious violation of people's need to have health services. Decoupling the police from immigration enforcement is also something that is so crucial to what it means. Again, thinking about this as beyond something that's budgetary. Right. So if we look at the fact that, of course, tens of, I think by just 1 second here, actually, I have the number. Well, it doesn't matter. It's over 8,000 per year police referrals to immigration authorities across Canada. So if we think about the fact that we know that Black people in particular are disproportionately stopped by the police. And we know that for our communities that often also, if you are somebody who does not have full legal status, that kind of police stop can also lead into arrest, into deportation. So decoupling police from actually the encounters is something that from working with CBSA, with immigration, is something that again is protecting some of our more marginalized communities. I like to think about defunding as something that just looks to all the places where people are the most abandoned in terms of safety in our society, and removing police from the equation and adding something else, right? So if we want to talk again, like to go back to this example of decoupling police from overdose responses, of course, that's not only taking away one of a really prominent demand that has been part of this movement across North America is also for a safe supply of drugs, which we know would actually be something that has the capacity to actually counter the overdose crisis, the drug poisoning crisis, the presence of harm reduction and non-mandatory supports for people who are using drugs, right? Something that accompanies the decoupling of police from immigration controls is, of course, status for all, right? It comes with the accompanying demand of giving people status so that people are not in danger of losing their homes. Another aspect, and you can just interrupt me anytime, but something I think that beyond the decoupling is actually reducing the power of police. And this is something that, again, is very firmly part of what is at the heart of the defunding movement, and reducing police powers in a country like Canada. There are so many really important ways that we can look to that. I already mentioned the criminalization of drugs as being one really important site in which there's this massive power, particularly over Black people since the war on drug exploded in the 1980s, whether you look at arrests for cannabis, whether you look at arrests for any other kind of substances. We know that Black people are being disproportionately targeted. And also, it's very clear that it's always been very clear that the criminalization of drugs is not, from a public health perspective, is nothing that brings public health. So in some ways, it's actually a barrier to public health. So reducing the power of police vis-a-vis the criminalization of drugs, the criminalization of sex work is another really important crux of this, especially if we look at the ways that Black women, migrant women, Indigenous women have been historically policed. In terms of prostitution laws, that's another really crucial element of that. Even looking at decriminalizing the many bylaws that are at this time used against people who are using public space, against poor people, right? Who again are disproportionately Black, disproportionately Indigenous. If we were to really look at what it meant to actually reduce the criminalization of poverty, right? Whether that's urination in public, and instead investing in things like public restrooms, instead of criminalizing loitering, having access to safe and decent, affordable housing for all. We're looking at, this time where we're seeing the policing of the encampments, right, in Toronto, in Edmonton and other cities. And what would it mean to instead not only, of course, disinvest from the policing and decriminalize encampments, right, but to actually, again, invest those public funds into long-term safe housing, right? So I really think that if we think about defunding as an expansive vision for safety, as a way of actually addressing racial and social economic inequalities vastly, as opposed to continually policing them and continually harming people, and we know also killing people, right? Especially in the context of mental health crises, it's really just in some ways actually looking to address harm in our society meaningfully, as opposed to meeting harms and people who are lacking in all kinds of resources, meeting that with more repression. So that's why I see it as something that really is vastly transformative, that really is, and that's where the idea of abolition as a kind of world building comes into it. It's really about building a world of safety, as opposed to only taking something away, or only just about reallocating particular municipal budgets. But at the same time, I don't want to diminish the very important work that's happening. I think it's a quite radical and a really incredible demand by Black Lives Matter Toronto, by Black Lives Matter and the Defunding Coalition in Montreal and in other cities, to cut the municipal policing budget by 50%, given that in a city like Montreal, the policing budget being $1 billion is just over $1 billion, it's not something that can be ethically justified. It's not something that can be morally justified. And as we're having a public shift towards understanding the real nature of policing, the history of policing as always anti-Black, as always harming Indigenous communities, then we start to get into a different place that says, what if we actually wanted to keep people safe? What would we do instead?
Robyn, I'm going to let Desmond speak, but while he's doing that, we have a request for you to return to that 8K year figure stat on CBSA. So if you want to find that stat, Desmond, go ahead, and then we'll come back to you for that, Robyn, and then we'll move on. So go ahead,
In fact,
Desmond.
while Robyn was speaking, I was looking up because I remember a study and I found it here. It's from University of Ottawa criminology professor David Moffat, who in 2017 released a study called Often Asking, Always Telling. And this was specifically a study about Toronto Police Service and the Canada Border Services Agency. David Moffat looked at 8 months of Toronto Police Service activity between themselves and CBSA, and he found that they made about 3,300 calls to the Canada Border Service Agency, did the Toronto Police, and he also found that 83.4% of those calls were for status checks. So literally the Toronto Police calling CBSA to say, is this person a citizen of Canada? And if not, what is their immigration status? So that's just one example, and I'm sure that there are many more. I really want to take up what you started with, Elle, and what Robyn so ably expanded on, which is the notion of the defunding as shorthand. Because, you know, I've been living in Canada for almost 4 decades. I was born here, but I mean, like, in Canada, if somebody's really angry about Canadian media and they say, defund the CBC, or if I see that hashtag trending on Twitter, as I often do, I feel like everybody kind of knows what people mean when they say defund the CBC. Like, they don't mean slightly reduce their budget. It is a shorthand for a larger gripe about this institution that they don't like, and they don't agree with its direction and its perhaps political orientation and so forth. And in the same way, I totally agree. Defunding the police is a shorthand for a much more, as Robyn said, expansive view of the world. I heard Ruth Wilson Gilmore talking recently and saying that, you know, when we talk about abolition, we're literally talking about a complete reorganization of the way the world works right now, nothing less than that. So it's such a broad and ambitious vision. To add to what Robyn has said, what I see going on with the kind of co-opting of that vision is to take that shorthand of defunding and try to make it mean something limited versus the intended conversation that we are all having, to try and limit it to say, well, we can freeze a budget here and there for a year. Perhaps we can take away a couple of mil and reinvest it into some community programs. We've seen initiatives in Toronto where city councillors have proposed that for every new dollar of police spending, there ought to be $2 for what they call community funding, because they cannot imagine a world where we simply stopped funding policing. So they have to tie the community's fortunes in the future to the ever-present and ongoing police funding. So we see a lot of different interpretations, misinterpretations, intentional distortions of the conversation of what we're talking about when we say defunding. But I think that the really important thing about it for me is, what is the purpose of the police? What is it that the police are asked in our society to do? And if we were to look at all of the situations that Robyn just delineated, I mean, I feel like that's almost everything that the police do. In the white settler imaginary, the police stop assaults from happening. They stop robbers who are coming out of the house. They catch murderers and shoot them before they shoot somebody. And in that imaginary, that's actually what the police are doing. But in real life, we all know that that's not actually what the police are doing. The police are in our cities answering that mental health call. The police are dealing with somebody who is intoxicated in a public park. The police are evicting the homeless from encampments. You know, the police are arresting people who are engaged in sex work in public. That's what they're actually doing versus this imaginary frontier sheriff keeping everybody safe from the kind of shadowy harm that is about to befall them. And the introduction of things like police officers in our schools, as Robyn mentioned earlier, and which I've also written about, unimaginable in Canada 30 years ago, I think in most circumstances. This was not part of the mainstream conversation. And it's so interesting to me how quickly, especially in our cities, especially in the places where Black people are the most present, how this narrative about how we must have a cop buddy for young Black people. They don't need a school program, they don't need counseling, they don't need after-school support, or their parents don't need childcare or employment opportunities. They need a cop buddy so that they can learn how to respect authority, and authority that is they should expect to follow them for the rest of their lives. And so for me, I'm very, very interested in us trying to challenge people for whom policing is a necessity, even if they think that it's a necessary evil, right? Even if they agree that it's too expensive, even if they agree that it causes disproportionate harm to Black and Indigenous and racialized communities, that they cannot conceive of a world where policing as it exists now ceases to exist. I feel like this is a place where I'm personally interested in spending a lot of time, particularly for those of us who are trying to push for something different. In Ottawa this week, they've been having this conversation, and there have been proposals, for example, to freeze the police budget in Ottawa at its current level, which is hundreds of millions of dollars. And I think for me, I really want us to sit and think together, what is the goal that we are trying to accomplish, and what does merely freezing a police budget do to reach us towards that goal? Because the more ambitious targets of at minimum 50% that groups, as Robyn mentioned, like BLM Toronto and Montreal are talking about, that represents, even just in people's mind when they hear have that budget, that is a substantial reorganization of what the police mean and what their role is. And like, that's really for me where we must go, rather than allowing those who would like to offer a few $1 million back to the public coffer and call it a day. We cannot allow that to become the mission, because they will take that and run with it in order to preserve the RCMP, in order to preserve Canada Border Services Agency and our municipal police forces.
Thank you. If people see me looking down, it's because people who are watching are messaging things. And I did want to mention something that Lindsay Jennings from Toronto Prisoners' Rights Project, a really amazing advocate for incarcerated people, for people living in street-involved situations. So holla at Lindsay. And one of the things she submitted, because she can't come on the Zoom, is this idea of police nonprofits as well. So police starting nonprofits. There's one in Toronto, Protect Engage Force 416. I don't know if you've heard of this. The Halifax Regional Police also started a similar thing. And Desmond, I know we've talked about this, how the police then position themselves as a charitable force. So will, for example, receive donations from corporate entities in order to so-called fund computers or sports equipment for youth. And the idea that you give to the police to do this rather than just give directly to community organizations is this other form of refunding the police. So Lindsay raises that as another way that the police manage to infiltrate spaces under this notion of charitable contributions. So you can respond to that, but I also wanted to, and I'm mindful of time because I know there's questions. So we've done one answer and we're got 10 minutes left or something. But since we're speaking to sociologists, I did want to take up something that also came up in the scholar strike. I think of the conversation between Beverly Bain and Adil Abdullahi, for example, talking about the complicity of university departments in not only literally policing, as departments train police, for example, for police certificates, but as Adil has talked extremely cogently about, how just the way we imagine the classroom space and the way we police that space and imagine it as a particular kind of safety contributes to the kind of ideologies you were talking about. But I thought since we're in front of sociologists, I did want to take up this question. Depending on how your department's organized, you may be like a social crim department. And we know that people often then end up doing research, for example, directly in prisons that you often only get ethics clearance, usually only get ethics clearance for if it's supported by CSC, so that we end up with research only approved by those who are, of course, engaged in oppressing people. The kind of complicities, yeah, exactly, around like being part of police certificate programs. So I wondered if either of you, and Desmond, of course, through journalism as well, you've obviously experienced a kind of institutionalization of police voices, of Crown voices, of particular authoritative voices. So I thought it would be productive to maybe have that conversation here as well, that for sociologists, for people inside academia or people inside other forms of institutions where we may think of that outside of policing. How does a sociologist contend with, for example, the ways that research often takes part in policing structures, often takes part in reinforcing the way that we experience police power? I don't know if either of you want to take that on, but. No. So I just said it and you're like, we're good. Desmond, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was on mute. As you can go first and I'll go after you this time.
Okay.
Okay. Not being a sociologist myself and not really having any authority or great knowledge in that world, I will say that when I was trying to get ready for this, I was reading a piece by Tamari Kitosa, who I know just did a presentation for CSA recently that I saw on YouTube, and then I went and started looking at some of his work. And he has this essay that I started reading about halfway through called Authoritarian Criminology and Racist Statecraft, Rationalizations for Racial Profiling, Carding, and Legibilizing the Herd. And this is fire. Like, I just started reading this and I'm like, oh, this is so good. And like, maybe I should go back to school and do my sociology, because I was really feeling a lot of the ideas that were in here around criminologists essentially taking for granted that there is such a thing as crime, that crime is not the empty container that we have simply filled with all of our social insecurities and biases, but that crime is actually a real thing. And that because crime is real, the responses to crime are necessary, and just we're kind of stuck with them, as I was alluding to earlier. So Tamari Kitosa is on it, and I would highly, highly recommend that people read that essay. But from a journalism perspective, Elle, I think what I think about a lot is when you work in a newsroom, one of your main newsroom functions, how do Bell Media and Rogers and all of them, how do they get the news to you every day? In large part, it is by having an ever-present connection to local and provincial police forces to kind of get from them what the day's news is about a car crash, about a fire, about a robbery, about an arrest, about criminal charges. And because newsrooms are so deeply reliant on police as the official source of what is happening and why it matters and what official information is, they do not want to compromise their relationships with the police by doing all of this pesky reporting about how the police are engaging in our communities. Doing so and asking really difficult questions, pointing out police's lies and their PR stunts and all the rest of it, is not really useful to you as, especially just like a frontline news desk person, when you're trying to maintain that good relationship with that police communications person so that they will tell you the news that you need to take to your corporation and go publish. And so certainly from a journalistic perspective, this is the kind of thing that if I was ever teaching journalism, I would really want to think about and talk about. How is it possible for media to be so-called objective and neutral, which is a criticism that I see Tamari Kitosa making in criminology as well, this disinterested perspective. How is that possible when you're making money off of the production of news? It is impossible. And so it's really important for us to think about when we watch the news and when we see, for example, when I talked about the SIU earlier, most reporting on death, serious injury, or sexual assault on the part of police officers, most of it is simply stenography of oversight news releases. The oversight body says, here's what the police may have been involved in. We're looking into it. 4 or 5 lines, no detailed information, passive voice. A police officer was involved in an interaction with a man, and during the interaction, the police officer's firearm was discharged. And then the media takes that up, and you will see media talking about members of the public who have been murdered by the police and refusing to say, though the police shot them, the police choked them, using verbs, using active language. They are always describing something as if it is an abstract idea. And so that relationship between the media and the police, that symbiotic relationship, is one that we really have to think about when we're like reading the news and trying to understand what it's telling us.
Thank you. There's a request to repeat that title. I posted it into the chat.
Yeah, it is Authoritarian Criminology and Racist Statecraft. That's the short heading, by Tamari, Tamari Kitosa, Kitossa. I found this and downloaded it under a Creative Commons license. Thank you, free learning.
Go ahead, Robyn.
Thank you so much, Desmond. And I would echo, I had referenced a lot of Tamari Kitossa's work in the section in my book on the war on drugs. He's done some really valuable work in terms of linking Canadians specifically, the ways that the war on drugs has particularly targeted and harmed Black communities. So I would add that. So I suppose, Elle, just to answer your question in a broad sense, I think that we all need to ask ourselves as researchers, and in terms of where we position ourselves, particularly in a time like this, when I really do believe that I think that we should always try to live up to a high ethical standard. But I think, having lived through these massive protests of the summer that have really shaken the world, have shaken society in this massive way, we all need to ask ourselves, am I working in the service of freedom, or am I working in the service of institutions that prevent freedom? And to situate yourself accordingly, right? I think that it's really important for us to remember that, as Desmond highlighted so beautifully, that there's no such thing as being objective, that we're living in a time in which people are dying unnecessary and tragic deaths continuously because of social forces that are literally organized to allow people to die, right? To expose people to vulnerability. Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls this premature death. Right, that's organized across our society. Whether we look at the ongoing, the ongoing refusal until quite recently to even consider that something else should occur besides a police officer if somebody's having a mental health crisis, even though we've seen, with the expansion of policing budgets over the last several decades, a significant expansion in the hands of people dying at the hands of police, particularly people with mental health use or people with substance use issues. Right, so we need to again ask ourselves, are we willing to use our work to try to interrupt the status quo, to try to create a new normal, or are we only working within the terms that have already been set up for us? So I love that Desmond brought up this notion about the way that crime is used as a neutral category. And I think that that's something that's really important for us to remember. Are we concerned with ending crime as a society, or are we concerned with ending harm? Because there are two very different answers to how we would organize there are so many different ways that we would organize the world if we were trying to end harm instead of trying to end crime. I think it's really important, if we're going to be using these terms, to understand the historical association between crime and Blackness, the ongoing historical association between crime and Blackness in a country like Canada, where enslaved Black people who ran away were, of course, considered criminals for asserting their humanity. Right, that the earliest association between Black peoples in the public realm was about criminality. This is something that's really important for us to ask. Are we concerned with ending crime in neighborhoods, for example, where there is lack of access to affordable housing, decent transit, and food deserts? Or are we concerned with ending harm, which of course would actually be the lack of access to housing, the lack of ability to get around, the lack of ability to eat healthy and decent food? So if we want to end crime in any given neighborhood, then we have one answer. The natural response to that has historically always been policing in some incarnation, whether it's community policing, whether it's more Black police, but there's only one solution, to the thing that's called crime. But if we look at the thing that's called harm, then we have suddenly at our disposal so many more tools. So I think it's really important for us to look at the terms that we use and look at the concepts that we use and ask, what does this serve? What purpose does this serve? Something that I've also always been concerned with my own work is taking up certain kinds of, again, this is kind of, again, just within the notion of what's considered criminal, of certain kinds of concepts. The idea of human trafficking in particular being taken up uncritically is something that I've seen as a Black woman with a long history of involvement in the sex worker rights movement. We see this uncritical use within some elements of social sciences, within the media more broadly, uncritically associating human trafficking to mean every single kind of involvement in sex work, including consensual, including working in a strip club, including working part-time at a massage parlor, all of this being equated with the idea of slavery, right? So appropriating this idea of anti-slavery, but then again, making the response to the crime of human trafficking, which is also often just working in the sex industry, crime control, which is policing, right? So we're using here the idea of so-called anti-slavery in a way that actually supports the criminalization of Black women, supports the criminalization of Indigenous women, supports processes that end up with the deportation of migrant women, for example, right? So again, if we're to break down the category and say we're against exploitation, then we end up actually with what I think is a vastly improved critique of capitalism, right? Of the exploitation of women in particular, of the exploitation of Black and racialized and Indigenous women in particular. And then of course, again, we get to a very different answer, which points to the fact that we need a vast social transformation to actually end poverty, create conditions for actual labor protections, as opposed to, again, relying on this sort of very crime and repression-based focus for how we think. So again, just to really bring it back to, are we working in the service of freedom? Are the concepts that we use, are the things we're supposedly trying to fight, is this in the service of broader human freedom? Which I think a good barometer for that is Black and Indigenous people's lives, in particular as the people in Canada who have been so historically deprived of freedom most expansively. And I think that if we're not looking, for example, to the realities of Black trans women, the realities of undocumented Black women, the realities of all the different Black people on sort of the margins of what it means to be Black, then that's the way that we need to think about what our work should be in the service of. That's the kind of freedom that we need to think about our work in the service of, is expanding freedom in that sense.
I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to move to the Q&A. There's quite a few questions already in the chat, so I want to give space to that. The last question I wanted to ask, and this goes back to this notion of harm that you raised, Robyn, as well as things that both of you have at least gestured at in your comments, which is one of the responses that people have, of course, had to demands to defund is this idea that, well, we can turn to the social work system, for example, to pick up that role. And so I wanted us to have a discussion of the carcerality of the care professions as well. Robyn, you wrote in Policing Black Lives around the policing of Black women, particularly through the child welfare system and social work system, which in many ways permits more trespass. It's a very intimate form of policing that can and does police your sexual life, your financial life, come into your home, look through your cupboards. So I would like us also to spend a little time problematizing the idea that professions like nurses or doctors who go into prisons are somehow still part of a so-called caring profession, or that the teachers that, call the police that handcuff Black children are somehow opposed to policing or part of something that's opposite to policing. And then of course, when we look at the child welfare apparatus and the social work apparatus, which is being invoked by many people as an alternative to policing. So I wanted in our last sort of bit before we move to these public questions to spend some time breaking that down, challenging some of these notions of what care is in opposition to harm when that care is still wielded by the state. I don't know if either of you wants to take that first. Go ahead, Desmond.
Well, I would just say that I feel like it's the coercive and violent factor that is the distinction, no matter what kind of social role or profession that we're talking about. A friend of mine told me a story just recently about seeing a person collapsed on the ground. They had a dog with them, a very prominent street corner in Toronto. And they were kind of lying on the ground in a way that is like they fell or something has happened to this person. And their dog is sitting there loyally next to them, just kind of waiting for them to come to. And so my friend and their friend go up and start trying to assist this person who's lying on the ground. And within a few moments, the police arrive. And the police see that this person needs medical attention. And so they call paramedics who arrive on the scene. And I think that's good because that seems to be what that person needed in that moment. But then what follows in the interaction is the police sitting by as the paramedics check this person out, say that they're fine, ask the person, would you like to go to the hospital? To which the answer is, no, I wouldn't like to go, I'm fine. And then the police reinserting themselves into that scenario and saying, no, we actually insist now, since you've had us come down here and waste our time, we insist that you go to the hospital. Plus, we don't really want you to languish on this street corner. And after that, the paramedics actually assisted the police in taking this person and forcing them onto a stretcher against their will. The role that paramedics play that is often just not talked about at all, the role of paramedics in a situation like the murder of Abdurrahman Abdi in Ottawa in 2016, where paramedics come to the scene of an apartment building and that they see that the police are there with a man handcuffed behind his back, laying in a pool of his own blood, not moving. And that this is the condition that the police are now asking those paramedics to, like, here you go, your turn, you deal with this. And there's no letter from the association of the paramedics saying we were appalled by the situation. There's like a, well, you know, like, I guess this is like how the system is working right now. I guess this is what the rules are. We have to comply with whatever coercive forces are out there that say that these people need to be dealt with in this way. The decision, like you mentioned, school, Elle, calling the police to come get a 6-year-old child in Mississauga who's having a tantrum in her classroom. The decision by school administrators to call the police on that child. That's not an accident. It's because they're like thinking to themselves, we would love to put our hands on this child, but the law doesn't give us the authority to do that in the same way that the police have the authority. But the impetus for someone to put their hands on this 6-year-old Black girl is what is the problem. It's the police that will come afterwards, of course, that we'll learn about and hear about, and that will become the focus of the story. But it was somebody's decision that simply talking to this girl, using all of the techniques that childcare workers and teachers use every day rather than using force, as is their responsibility, that's not enough for this Black child. That's, I think, at the root of the issue. And so, yeah, like, that's why social workers are able to do such harm. That's why teachers are able to do such harm. That's why paramedics, I think of Yosef Al-Hasnawi in Hamilton, who intervened in a situation where he thought someone was hurting another person. He was shot, and the paramedics who came to the scene of the crime first ridiculed his condition and basically told him that he was faking it, and then he died. That was a rare case where paramedics were actually criminally charged. But it just goes to show us, I think, that it's not exactly just about the badge and the gun and the legal authority to use force that the police have. It's about the desire to control people using force rather than using other methods, which can be really anywhere. It can be in any workplace. It goes so far beyond, like, that's like the small p policing, if you will, to capital P policing, as I like to think about it.
Robyn, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that, Desmond. I think that I think it's so important to have an expansive understanding of how what policing looks like, where it takes place, because I think that that's something that's really crucial as we enter into a really important moment where the police are under scrutiny, facing a certain kind of legitimacy crisis, which is, you know, it's really important that we finally gotten to this place as a society, but I also think that also gives us kind of a responsibility to push a little bit further in terms of how we understand policing. So when I wrote, when I was researching and writing Policing Black Lives, something that was really crucial to me was not only tracing policing within law enforcement, but understanding the ways that racialized and gendered surveillance and punishment are embedded into multiple institutions across society and are part of the emergence in many cases of those institutions. So of course, that also involves understanding the history of border controls in this country and globally as something that's very much related to the policing of Blackness. That's something that from a Canadian perspective, we need to understand that child welfare more broadly is something that has historically been about segregating Black children, about treating Black children as inferior to white children, as less worthy of protection than white children within Canadian schools as well, particularly in the provinces where segregation was legal and practiced, and in Halifax until 1983, in Ontario until 1964. So we need to understand that the policing of Black people's lives is something that extends well beyond law enforcement and well beyond the criminal justice system. And that's really crucial for us, particularly in a moment of defunding, of course, as we're talking about we were talking about the ways that defunding can sort of be misused. I think it's really important to remember it's not just about transferring coercive power from the police to another institution that also especially has a history of the violent policing of Black people. So I would never uncritically say that we should push towards replacing police with any particular institution, be it whether it's social work, whether it's forced psychiatrization. Like we're not pushing for just another kind of carceral controls over peoples. We're not pushing for increased child removals, right? So it's not about shifting that responsibility for control and repression. It's about, again, about building the capacity to support people differently, right? And that involves something that's perhaps more complex than replacing one carceral system with another. But if we're looking at ending harm and we're looking at building, then that particularly requires us to actually invest in a wide assortment of things, right? So something that Dorothy Roberts in particular has been working on for decades, but particularly more recently has been showing us not only does child removal, if we understand child removal as something that is particularly targeting Black and Indigenous families related to poverty, right? But the cost of actually keeping children in care, doing violence to both the child and the family actually is in many cases more than most families living in poverty have, right? So what if we, she really suggests the abolition of the child welfare as we know it towards, again, reinvesting instead in poor Black families, in families more broadly, right, and ending poverty as opposed to continuing this system that is very carceral for many families. So I think that, again, really just looking to this expansive kind of world building that needs to take place in terms of actually, again, long-term affordable housing, affordable public transit, harm reduction supports for people using drugs, affordable free childcare for all, clean water, community gardens, status for all. Like these are all ways that we can start to begin to address, also just to name one more thing, like what had been forwarded by BLMTO and other groups is like MAD co-led responses to mental health crises, right? That we need to actually create conditions, create safety in our society in ways to actually meet people's needs. So just replacing, the social worker or any kind of other institution to come and manage a situation isn't getting us isn't actually preventing crises, which is what we should actually be geared towards, right? We shouldn't be just continually responding to the multiple crises that come from lack of access to the things that people need, which is like a decent place to live, the kinds of supports for mental health crises, right? It's about actually preventing that in the first place. And that can only be done if as a society, we actually radically commit to investing, again, in the root causes of harm, which is gross racial and gendered and sexual and economic inequality. Right. So fundamentally, I think there is no way that even if we perhaps saw an end to particular kinds of, shooting deaths at the hands of police or something, we're not going to see an end of carceral kinds of violence unless we really move away from thinking there is sort of a one catch-all way of repressing a certain social issue and actually look to meeting that needs, to meeting those needs. And one thing I just wanted to add is also the importance, if we're going to be talking about building and alternatives, is of course land back, right? The idea, thinking about defunding is not only about yeah, what it means to really beat people's to meet people's needs again in a settler colony in which people's lands are still continually being encroached upon and stolen, and when land defenders are being violently met with policing, means that we actually need to think very seriously about the importance of the land back struggles that are happening right now. And that I think if we're going to be really expansive about what it means to think about the abolition of policing as we know it, then one aspect of that absolutely needs to be land back.
I echo that. Having been able to visit recently what's happening in Six Nations of the Grand River and the land defense struggle that's happening there, and the just outright contempt expressed through police against Indigenous peoples of the Six Nations of the Grand River. It's a Haudenosaunee community who've had 95% of the Haldimand Tract taken away from them after it was granted to them by the British. How the British can grant Haudenosaunee people their own land is a whole other conversation. But I totally agree with what you're saying, Robyn. And I wanted to add a couple of things inspired by what you just said. First of all, this is a book, and I don't know if you guys can.
You can't see the title.
I've got too much light reflecting on it here.
A Violent History of Benevolence.
A Violent History of Benevolence, Interlocking Oppression with the Moral Economies of Social Work. This is a book by Chris Chapman and AJ Withers, and lighting is just awful there. Is that a little bit better there? Yeah. So I just wanted to show you all this book just to say that we're all on our own journeys of learning, and AJ Withers is one of those people who has really challenged me in terms of my own thinking about what the social work world is, and the mistake that Robyn was just talking about of thinking that we can simply transfer this responsibility of controlling people from one institution to another. So I want to shout out AJ and Chris and this really excellent book. I also wanted to say, in terms of imagining something different, and when we say that, you know, we're imagining something radically different from what exists now, at the same time, these kinds of interventions that are alternatives are right in front of us all the time. And I just want to give two really quick examples. When Sammy Ateem was on a streetcar by himself in 2013, before he was shot and killed by James Forcillo, the Toronto police officer, Sammy came onto that bus, or on that streetcar, sorry, and he was armed with a knife, and he was obviously in a lot of distress and confusion. And the TTC streetcar driver approached Sammy in that time and asked him what he needed. Imagine. And Sammy said, you know, I would really like to speak with my dad. Imagine a world, instead of having dozens of armed police officers rush to the scene, that we had spent a fraction of those resources to locate this young man's father and kept him there until somebody who he's familiar with and remember or knew could come there and try to help him get through that situation. It was completely within our grasp, and we know that that happened because a TTC driver had the common sense to say, what do you need right now? And that was a completely alternate response from what ended up happening, which was Sammy being murdered by a police officer. And the other example that I think of, because we're talking about child welfare, is that the three of us are all very familiar with the struggle of Fatuma and Abdul Abdi. And shout out to our sister Adil Abdullahi, who's also done so much work on this issue with us. Fatuma and Abdul told us when they were apprehended from their aunt and taken into the care of Department of Community Services in Nova Scotia, that they were not allowed to speak Somali to each other as young immigrant refugee children who are new to this country and who just want to be able to have something familiar with each other, that they were not allowed to communicate with each other in their own language. And I just imagine, like, instead of people in the childcare system being afraid and thinking that children trying to communicate with each other required a punitive response, what it would have meant for them to facilitate those young people speaking to one another as they could, or even imagine giving them other people in their community that they could talk to, that they could communicate with in their own language. These kinds of interventions are not beyond us. They're not like these unimaginable things that someone has to think and sit around and try to create. They are right there. but it's the need for punishment and the desire for punishment that obscures interventions that are actually life-saving, that are actually caring, that are actually supporting. So we know how to do these things. We have to start choosing them more often.
All right, y'all, we have like 20 minutes. So I'm going to urge your answers to these questions to be both thorough and concise. All right, so I'm going to just go down the list. Hopefully we make it through. So there's quite a few that we can clump, particularly around the bureaucracy of overseeing policing. There's quite a few in that area. But the first question from Carl Flecker. Thank you to all panelists. Interested to hear your thoughts on how to advance defund given the legislative barriers, i.e. Police Services Act, Municipal Act, and perhaps even Canadian Labor Code, which some would argue protects federal regulated workers. This last point might apply to CBSA and RCMP, though that is debatable. How does defund tackle these legislative challenges? So I don't know if there's thoughts on that. That's also tied to a question by Melissa Bauman. Municipal councils also state that police budgets are out of their hands, that it's at the provincial level, at least in Ontario. How can we ensure local municipal councils enact change in these areas? So we have two related questions about kind of the bureaucracy that prevents defunding from moving forward, and if you have any ideas around that.
I mean, I think that just as a thanks for reading these questions, by the way. I think that it's important to remember that bureaucracy magically appears and disappears depending on what's considered a crucial issue, depending on what's considered vital, depending on what's considered a public crisis, right? So if we look at the response to the COVID pandemic, for example, we see that things that we were always told were impossible, suddenly because the public was at risk, the public beyond Black and Indigenous people was at risk due to an illness that was not discerning, although it of course disproportionately impacts our communities, that's not biologically not violent. That's not, let me just find the right words for what I'm trying to say. We suddenly have something that's threatening, I guess, who's conceived of as the broader public, which includes white middle-class Canadians, which includes anybody, right? So suddenly, things that were impossible are shifted. We suddenly see even the release of people from provincial jails in Ontario and Nova Scotia. We see the return of many detainees for immigration detention. Of course, this is fought for by people behind bars and people outside of bars. But again, something that was conceived of that we would have continually been told was impossible, even though we always knew that for incarcerated people, that captivity was itself a public health crisis for the incarcerated. But once it began to be a risk for public health, people who are not incarcerated, people whose lives are actually valued in this society, we see that suddenly we can move, we can make a change. It's possible for people to be returned for their communities. It's possible for massive shifts in the society, for we've been continually told that something like a universal income was politically impossible in many ways, right? And then we suddenly see this shift because it's considered crucial and vital. So I think that it's just really important to remember that bureaucracy gets in the way when something's not considered important, right? If there was no safe drinking water in the city of Ottawa, I think we would see very quick action taken by the municipality, the provincial government, and the federal government. But we see for Indigenous communities on reserves, because they're not considered to be part of the public who we protect, there's so much bureaucracy, it somehow has taken decades for this to be treated, right? So I guess I just really think that bureaucracy is we just need to understand bureaucracy as a way to just manage and divert attention from addressing these issues, right? I think that that's what we're starting to see is a public shift, I think, that actually is creating some interesting changes, though, where we're seeing that by some studies, over half of Canadians support the notion of defunding police, at least somewhat, right? And we're starting to see at least a sort of lip service for something that was like politically unimaginable. To even stop police budget increases was something that was sort of politically nearly impossible, right? And now we're starting to see at least this openness on behalf of some city councilors, these discussions about alternatives, as high up as the mayor, right? Because we're seeing that this public shift, and again, a legitimacy crisis of the police. So I think that people continuing to be involved in and supporting these movements, showing a very public and a very wide-spanning support is something, and just maintaining that pressure is something that continues to help, impossible things suddenly be achievable, right? We need to remember that it's always a political choice to to keep the status quo as it is, because those people who are losing their lives tend to be disproportionately Black, Indigenous people living with mental health crises or mental health issues. Sorry about that. So I just think that if we reprioritize people's lives who have not been prioritized, who have been deprioritized, if we treat our lives as facing the crisis that they are, if the broader public would actually do that and push with that same urgency that they would for something that's considered to be a public health crisis, then I think we would see a lot of that bureaucracy fall away.
Desmond, you want to take this or? Okay.
Really quickly, just retweet everything that Robyn just said. And I just would add to this notion that really this is about when there's a will, then there is a way. If Carl Flecker is the same Carl Flecker that I think it is, then shout out to my comrade. Nice to hear from you, and thank you for the question. I'll just say this. We as Black and Indigenous people are putting our lives on the line. I just mentioned the 6 nations of the Grand River near Caledonia. People are out there defending their territory, and they're willing to confront the OPP with their very lives. You know what we're asking from municipal politicians? If the budget don't look right, then don't vote for it. Vote against the flippin' budget. Don't you have the legislative authority to do that? And by the way, if that triggers some issue where now the police service is not adequately funded under the Municipal Act or the Police Services Act, create that confrontation with the province of Ontario. Doug Ford is not our friend in the case of Ontario, and Stephen McNeil in the case of Nova Scotia. These people are not our friends. And it is actually in the same way that people are willing to put up a barricade, are willing to sleep outside of a police station, are willing to march, risk their lives during a pandemic, in the same way that Black and Indigenous people are doing that. We're asking municipal politicians to vote no or withdraw. It's amazing how creative people can be when there's an impetus for them to be creative about something. You as a municipal police force or as a municipal government, for example, don't have to authorize that a construction site has to have a man with a gun on it, as I saw when I was out taking a walk today. You can actually decide that that kind of extra paid duty frill for police is just not something that your municipality does anymore. The province can't come in and stop you. Are these politicians going to get arrested if they start shaking the table of the Municipal Act and the Police Services Act? If they stop complying with the norms, is somebody going to come and arrest them inside of their chambers? Of course not. We're risking our lives out here. So we're just asking people to get a little bit creative with us and to bring about some of these confrontations with the state in a legislative sense that we are doing in the street every day. The cowardice is unbelievable, and I could do another conversation about this, but in the interest of time, I think that we have to get creative. And I also think that the provision under the criminal code, section 25 of the criminal code, that talks about protections for law enforcement, that section of the criminal code gives the police the right to kill you as long as they feel that it is within their duties to kill you. And I think that that section of the criminal code needs to be repealed.
All right, Desmond, I know you love it when people talk about putting on hats, but I'm going to put on my moderator hat and suggest we rapid fire these as quickly as possible so we can
I actually hate that.
All right. So next question, Shalom, how? People often shut down after hearing words like defund and abolish. How do we continue conversations even, and perhaps particularly, with family members or friends when people are unreceptive or scared of the concept? And let's try and do these quickly. Go ahead. Anyone want to take that?
I'm so hard at being quick. I could try to take that quickly. I mean, I think there are people who have different takes on this. I think that to some extent, the words we use is important. Talking about things like defunding and abolition, to me, I try to use those words, especially right now, to really bring them into the public vernacular to help people be comfortable with these kinds of concepts. And to stand behind them. But I think even just explaining to what the basis of it is, you don't need to use the word abolition immediately to explain the history of police in this country and what they do. You don't need to use the word abolition to talk about what it means to build safety differently, right? So I think that even just from a very pragmatic sense, like getting to the bare bones of what we're getting at, which is take a different system of care in our society, I think that's something that you can start those conversations in all kinds of different ways. When I talk to my son about what the police do, I don't say defunding in the first sentence. I explain to him the way that people we know, that Leroy's dad got hurt by the police, but that means, so how else can we make sure that this person would be okay, right? So it's like we can have different kinds of conversations depending, and save language for once concepts are sort of firmly embedded. I think I could talk about this forever, but I think that's something. Yeah, I also ask my students to, very quickly aside, I ask my students.
Well, this actually answers the next question. So say that part, because the next question, so I'll double this up, is for teaching intro to sociology, for example, how can teachers begin the discussion given the different lived experiences of the students? So I'm assuming you're answering that as well. So go ahead, Robyn.
Okay, and I'll be very quick, and then I'm going to leave space for Desmond, and then I know we need to wrap up this webinar. But something that I was doing with my students this spring was to have them, go to the website of Correctional Services Canada and then define what they say they do. Go to the website of the police, whether it's the Toronto Police, whether it's any police officers, look at what they say they do, and then read accounts. Read the account of Arlene Gallone, who was held in, in 9 months isolation in a prison in Canada. Read the accounts, read Desmond Cole's account of Skinwer in the Toronto Life piece. Read accounts of, of people, of the experiences with the institution. And then, the exercise is, what's the difference? What's the difference between the described purpose of this institution and how people experience it? And I think that in 500 words leads people to have that reflection themselves of this institution is not about public safety, is not about this, at least from these people's perspective. It tends to do the opposite. So it's a way of showing, is the way of teaching just by showing the discrepancies between what our institutions purport to be about and what the way that they're actually experienced, especially by people who are Black, who are Indigenous.
Desmond, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree, and I would add to that a couple of things. Number one, your actions and the things that you're willing to do and sacrifice as an individual and as a member of your community always speak louder to people than having an argument over the Thanksgiving or a Christmas dinner table, which is like, I think, the classic political framing of how we imagine that we're supposed to have these arguments. Like, you're supposed to take on your angry uncle at dinner and to try and like shout him down when he tries to say these things. In fact, your actions and your consistency in service of thinking through and challenging yourself on these issues really demonstrates for people your commitment. We can never have these conversations one time and think that we've given somebody enough information or inspiration that they get it now. But I will say that what is always very interesting to me is that most people will say to you that the police taking the lives of Black and Indigenous people the way that they do is not acceptable. Like in an instance where something happens in our society and we see it in real time, people will say that's not acceptable, that's not the outcome that we want. At the very minimum, they'll say, yeah, I wish that it didn't have to be that way. But when the police and the politicians who prop them up, when they do things like, let's have body cameras now, they're not even trying to propose to you that will stop people from getting killed. And one of the conversations that I like to initiate with people is exactly how much violence are we expected as Black and Indigenous people to accept? If you're not saying that the intervention, body cameras, anti-racism training, tasers, beanbag shotguns, if you're not saying that these things will preserve life, make life better for people, give people care and support rather than violence, if you're not proposing an alternative, then you're just asking us as Black and Indigenous people to weather a certain amount of violence. And that's something that people have to sit with, because I have not heard any proposals in this country that are from any serious politician or political actor that says, if we implement this, we are going to see fewer people be surveilled, be unnecessarily stopped and carded, be followed around in their neighborhood, be stopped, humiliated, beaten, assaulted, arrested. They're not even proposing those things for us. And I have a problem with that, because even in your incrementalist liberal world, you have to at least try to pretend that you care about us enough to stop these things from happening. And so the burden can't just be on all of us to quell people's fears. The burden on them has to be, if you say that you don't want these kinds of social outcomes, what are you willing to do to challenge yourself? How much of this do you really expect people to take before they are in your streets, before they are disrupting session of city council, before they are doing all of the things that we do out of necessity because nothing else has worked? I think, Raven Wings gave a speech this summer where she talked about how just because we threw some paint on these statues of colonizers in downtown Toronto, that doesn't mean that we didn't first write the petitions to you, that we didn't go to the community meetings, that we didn't fill out all of the surveys. We've done all of these things. So if somebody has a better idea for how we're supposed to live safely, they need to propose that rather than simply saying that they're too scared to let us live free.
All right, the next one, I'm going to give one example, and let's rapid fire this, maybe just pull up a couple of examples. Is there a society or community which provides a good example for us in terms of alternatives to policing or the broader ideas behind defunding / abolishing these systems? I'm going to suggest that you look into transformative justice. For example, there's some collectives like the Third Eye Collective is a place to start in Montreal. So I suggest looking into that work, which is Black women, most of whom have themselves been victimized by violence, who understand that state punishment is not going to heal or solve or prevent crime or violence, and look at other ways of solving conflict. So transformative justice is one suggestion I can make there. Robyn and Desmond, any other suggestions just for practical, concrete, lived resources of doing things differently?
I mean, there are so many examples that are happening all the time that continue to be defunded in the sort of inappropriate sense of the word, in favor of funding more repression, right? So we have there are so often, I've witnessed this working in community organizations, really great, experiment, temporary short-term funding for these incredible anti-violence projects led by survivors, that are initiated, that are given 1 year of funding, where you see this, you see, like a Black or Indigenous woman hired, starts up this really powerful program, just gets the outreach going, and really begins to make inroads in terms of what it means to work with survivors, to deal with violence, to work in communities to prevent violence. And then what happens is those projects don't get their funding renewed, right? So I guess that what I'm trying to do is to just draw our attention to the fact that there are actually alternatives that are happening that are being underfunded or defunded all the time, right? Amanda Paris wrote so beautifully about this recently in a piece looking at the creation of these vibrant arts and community programs created in the wake of the so-called Summer of a Gun, and how all of those were just sort of slowly dismantled. And here we are again in the same situation, right? So I guess I just really want to point to the fact it's not about this creating this pie in the sky society. It's the fact that there are actually alternatives happening on the ground all the time, and they continue to be really deinstitutionalized, defunded, as we continue to pour more money into things like police trainings and body cameras. So I guess I'm just trying to bring us back to that, that fact that we're actually, we have alternatives all the time. There was almost a consent-based curriculum in Ontario, and who knows what kind of impact that could have had on future sexual assaults in the future, right? But then of course that was undone by the Ford government. So again, we see a non-taken up alternative that intervenes in actually the creation of future people who may commit harm. I'll end it there because I know we have 3 minutes. So I'll let you answer, Des.
So there are a lot of First Nations in Canada who have their own police forces. And the record of violence of First Nations police forces, while I cannot say it's perfect and it's a perfect solution, because none of these things are, there is such a dramatic difference in the way that people who are allowed to develop their own policing services and determine what their roles and responsibilities are going to be. There is such a dramatic difference, particularly in First Nations communities across Canada, to the way that those police interact with the community and the way that the RCMP does, the OPP does, and local police forces do. I will also say there is a Globe and Mail article from last year. I was just Googling it really quickly, and it's called Bear Clan No More, Why a Thunder Bay Safety Patrol Has Turned Away from Its Founding Principles of Cooperating with Police. This is a story about a local Thunder Bay patrol calling itself Bear Clan that organized because of the number of First Nations people in Thunder Bay who were being murdered or disappeared from their community. And they were doing amazing work, going out and doing safety patrolling and doing just safety assessments within the community, and really doing it from a grassroots perspective. But one day they witnessed the Thunder Bay police engaging in an act of police brutality, and they spoke out about it. And their funder cut their funding because their funder was like, listen, we work with the police and you're not allowed to criticize them in this way. So that's just what Robyn is saying as an example of a really successful community intervention that should still be happening and should be being replicated in other places, but is up against this tension of the funder being like, well, do we choose the state or do we choose the grassroots thing? And thinking about what we actually want our communities to look like in the future. Do we always want men with guns patrolling in our communities, or is there an alternative that's right in front of us that we're just not funding or that we're delegitimizing because it spoke too much truth?
Thank you. That does actually bring us out of time. There are a couple more questions we didn't get to. If you did give us a question we did not get to, thank you for participating. Sorry we did not get to you. I really want to thank both of you for giving so generously of your time. There's a lot of comments in the chat. And by the way, yes, it was your Carl, Desmond. He said, what's up? So thank you to everybody watching and attending and participating. Thank you to the Canadian Sociological Association for putting this on and for all the work Sherry and Xiaobei have done organizing this. Aaron, of course, for getting this pumping. And I do urge people to look up CPAP, Criminalization and Punishment Education Project. There's a number of GoFundMes and other donations you can make, including the very crucial jail line, which is not only a really crucial support for people inside, but also serves as a, I don't like to put it this way, but a source of data. It's a place where through their reports we're finding out what's really happening inside. And it's a very expensive line to run. So I do urge people to donate to that initiative. There's initiatives supporting people coming out of prison to make sure they have the resources to live. So please do look up CPAP online and consider making one of those donations. Thank you, everybody. Again, Desmond and Robyn, that was fabulous. A lot of people coming in my phone already saying how much they enjoyed this talk, how generous you were with your time. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to the organizers. Have a good night, everybody. And that's it from us.
And thank you so much to you, Elle. Thank you very, very much for guiding this conversation, for all the work that you're always doing, seen and unseen. We love you so much.
I do encourage people to follow the story of Randy Riley. Again, I'm going to flash my t-shirt. It just looks like I'm flashing my body. I don't know. But I do urge you to follow the story of Randy Riley. He is, I think, a real hero of this abolition movement. So as he goes along through this journey, we hope he won't have to be retried, but if he does face retrial, that kind of public pressure is really important. So look him up, and I hope we can also count on your support in that on the ground way that leads to actually abolishing systems of harm. And with that, I will stop talking. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elle, Desmond, and Robyn, for taking the time to share your important and very powerful work with us this evening. We have learned a great deal from you. I'm sure many of us will think hard about what you said and will share with our colleagues, students, and families. I also want to thank the audience to attend this important event and wish you well. Good night.